Hello and welcome. You're listening to Realpolitik Confidential, and I'm your host, Alex Krishan. Today it is the 24th of June 2025, and today's episode is titled From Tehran to Taipei, the Age of Grey Zone Wars. Now, if you've been following the headlines, you'll know that this isn't just another week in geopolitics. This is the beginning of a new era. A time when global conflict doesn't look like the war stories we grew up with. You know, we won't see tanks rolling across borders, declarations in the Security Council, or ticker tape parades. Instead, you'll see something stranger, almost invisible. War by proxy, war by cyberattack, war by law, by rumour, by drone swarm, by economic stranglehold. A war where nobody admits to fighting until the day we all realize it's too late. Today, the most dangerous battlegrounds are the ones nobody wants to name. The Strait of Hormuz, the skies above Israel, the contested islands of the Western Pacific, the routers in your basement, and the social media feeds on your phone. It's all connected, whether you see it or not. Let's pull back for a moment. In the old world, when war broke out, you'd know about it. Hell, there were even declarations. Guns would fire, ships would sink, and politicians would make speeches about faith and freedom and liberty and justice. But in 2025, war isn't declared. It just sort of seeps in. It seeps in through the cracks of peacetime. It looks like a drone strike in Iran. It looks like 1,000 Chinese warplanes buzzing the edge of Taiwan's airspace day after day until the world stops caring. It looks like power grids shutting down in the middle of winter, or container ships hijacked in the Red Sea, not by pirates, but by Houthi missiles with Iranian chips inside. We call it the grey zone. It's a term you'll hear from military planners, intelligence analysts, and think tankers in expensive suits sipping champagne. But here's what it really means. The grey zone is the space between war and peace. It's where states fight without fighting, coerce without shooting, destroy without even raising a flag. It's the twilight world of plausible deniability, shadow armies, cyber mercenaries, fake news, and real casualties. Let's break it down now. Why are we here? Why has war changed? Well, the first answer is quite intuitively technological. Cheap drones, smart bombs, hacking tools, AI-driven disinformation. All of these tools that used to belong only to superpowers are now available to anyone with a fat bank account or a state sponsor. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq launch rocket and drone strikes on American bases from hundreds of kilometers away, never showing their faces. China sends swarms of unmanned vehicles, civilian and military alike, across Taiwan's front lines. Both sides claim nothing happened. Everybody knows what they really did. And the second answer to the question, why has war so irrevocably changed? Well, the second answer is plain old politics. Direct war between major powers is now almost unthinkable, because the costs are too high and the world economy is too fragile. So the big players do something else. They sort of chip away at each other, slowly, methodically, always keeping things just below the line where somebody would have to fight back with everything they have. It's a global game of chicken, except the road is the South China Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Donbass, or your very own energy grid. The first answer is strategy. Grey zone warfare lets states advance their interests, sometimes grab territory, sometimes just sow chaos. But they manage to do this without triggering the kind of retaliation that could end careers, regimes, or even civilizations as we know it. It's the sort of slow-motion confrontation. It is the ultimate plausible deniability game. But make no mistake, just because no one's declared war doesn't mean people aren't dying. Ask the families of 3 US soldiers killed by an Iranian proxy drone in Jordan. Or ask the Taiwanese pilots scrambling 3 times a night because the PLA Air Force wants to see if they'll get tired or make a mistake. Ask the merchant crews held hostage for weeks in the Red Sea because their ship happened to be flying the wrong flag. Ask the Ukrainians who woke up to blackout and cyber chaos while the world debated whether a hybrid attack counts as an act of war. So who wins in this grey zone? Well, to be completely honest, the answer is the bold, the ruthless, and most importantly, the patient. The countries willing to invest in the shadows. The actors who don't care what you call them so long as their adversaries are exhausted, divided, and or afraid. And who loses? Well, often it's the open societies. The ones that play by the old rules, the ones that believe in clear lines, international law, and predictable outcomes. The ones that think war should be obvious and justice should be quick. Tonight we're going to walk you through this new reality. We'll go from the deserts of the Middle East to the islands of the Western Pacific. We'll show you how drones are changing the face of conflict, how proxy armies and cyber tools are giving even weak states the power to punch far above their weight, and how great powers are using every tool short of all-out war to get what they want. We'll analyze how Iran's proxy strikes and drone barrages have rewritten the rules in the Middle East, how China's relentless pressure on Taiwan is forcing the world to choose between strategic ambiguity and catastrophic clarity, how cyberattacks and disinformation are making broader borders irrelevant, and how the laws we thought protected us are being bent, twisted, or just simply ignored. Most importantly, we'll ask, how do you defend against a war that isn't a war? What happens when the lines blur so much that no one is sure where peace ends and conflict begins? And what risks do we all face if the world sleepwalks into a conflict no one is ready to name? Until it's too late. Well, let's go to definitions. Grey zone warfare refers to coercive statecraft actions that fall below the threshold of conventional war. It encompasses everything from political, economic, and legal pressure to covert operations, espionage, and sabotage. Analysts note that grey zone campaigns unfold gradually and are often unattributed, use legal and political justifications, and exploit societal or military vulnerabilities. In practice, this means states integrate multiple instruments of power, sort of open warfare, the successor to political warfare. As one study puts it, grey zone measures deliberately coerce others at the lower end of war, leveraging ambiguity and a mix of military and non-military tools to shape outcomes without triggering declared armed conflict. What is its core definition? Well, the core definition is actions deliberately short of war, diplomacy, lawfare, economic coercion, cyber operations used coercively to advance state interests. The strategic logic is to exploit the space between peace and war, to achieve gains while avoiding open warfare, For example, gray zone tactics allow pressure without risk of full retaliation. And its key features are such campaigns being state-sponsored, often deniable, legally ambiguous, and sustained over time. They may use proxies or hybrid forces to mask official involvement, integrating disinformation, cyberattacks, paramilitary raids, and economic measures in concert. Scholars warn that ambiguity is the strength and weakness of grey zone warfare. It creates deniability, yes, but also makes the line between peace and conflict blurry. Major powers such as China, Russia, the United States, and Iran have institutionalized grey zone concept in doctrine and strategy. For example, RAND analysts characterize Chinese grey zone tactics as coercive measures beyond normal diplomacy or economics, but below the use of kinetic force. Similarly, Western military writing often sees grey zone campaigns as layered coercion. For example, the use of cyber, of legal, and of paramilitary means. This is designed in order to maneuver around adversaries' red lines. For example, we had the Iranian drone and proxy warfare, which we will get into later. Overall, these grey zones provide both opportunity and immense risk. We could find ourselves sleepwalking into a conflict that no one actually desires. Just remember how the First World War started. An assassination in Sarajevo by a third party resulted in a conflict which killed millions of people across half a decade. So let's buckle up, because this isn't just a story about drones and generals. This is about your future. And this is Realpolitik Confidential Episode 8. From Tehran to Taipei, the Age of Grey Zone Wars. Historians will look back at the 2020s. They might not remember the speeches or the headlines. What they will remember, though, is the whine of a drone engine over a darkened sky somewhere far from home. Because in the age of grey zone warfare, the unmanned vehicle is king. And nowhere has this new era been more visible or more dangerous than over Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Israel. Let's start with a moment that felt almost like science fiction, if it weren't so brutally real. Most recently, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of drones and rockets launched from Iranian soil. We've seen radar screens in Israel's war rooms lit up like Christmas. Hundreds of drones and missiles launched directly from Iranian soil came streaking toward the heart of Israel. A barrage on a scale never before seen. The world held its breath. Israeli, American, and British, and even Jordanian air defenses scrambled to intercept the incoming swarm. When the dust settled, most of the drones and missiles had been shot down. But the message is crystal clear. Iran for the first time had launched a direct attributable attack on Israel using unmanned vehicles as its spear tip. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. For years, Iran has rewritten the playbook on proxy warfare. Forget the old days of smuggling AK-47s to guerrilla in the hills. Today, it's about Shahed drones, precision-guided missiles, and a regional web of allied militias who can strike without warning and without fingerprints. There have been a plethora of attacks on American bases in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan over the years. Most were drone attacks or rocket strikes launched by Iran's so-called Islamic resistance in Iraq, answer to Tehran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but can always be disavowed if the heat gets too high. And the targets? Well, the targets weren't just soldiers. There were supply convoys, oil refineries, critical infrastructure, even commercial shipping. Nothing is off limits in the age of grey zone warfare. If it flies, it can be hit. If it sails, it can be harassed. And every strike, successful or not, sends a signal. Iran can reach you anywhere and anytime. The logic is brutally simple. Drones are cheap. Some models cost less than a used car. They're hard to detect and relatively easy to launch, be it from desert bases, hidden trucks, or even merchant ships in the Gulf. If you can swarm them, send 50, 100, 1,000 at a time, some will inevitably get through. And if you get caught, well, you can always blame the militia. Deny everything. The fog of war becomes a wall of plausible deniability. The Houthis in Yemen, armed and trained by Iranian specialists, have turned the Red Sea into a shooting gallery. Their ballistic missiles and kamikaze drones have forced international shipping to reroute or risk getting hit. Israeli ports, far from the usual front lines, have come under drone attack for the first time in their history. Global trade, energy prices, even food on your table, all can be threatened by a handful of men in a shack flying a cheap drone program to strike with deadly precision. And then there are the proxies closer to Israel's borders, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq, who have been known to use drones not just for attacks, but for surveillance, for psychological warfare, and for testing enemy defenses. One buzzing, sleepless night at the time. Why does this matter for the grey zone? Well, because it lowers the threshold for violence and for escalation. A drone can be shrugged off as an accident, a provocation, or a technical malfunction. Until one of them hits a barrack or a fuel depot or, as it has happened before, a US outpost, killing American soldiers and wounding dozens more perhaps. Suddenly, what was below the threshold becomes a crisis. And here's the real risk. Every drone that flies, every proxy that fires, every attack that goes unpunished changes the rules. It normalizes aggression. It tempts the next actor to go just a little further, to push just a little harder, knowing that their fingerprints can always be wiped away. But technology doesn't stop for diplomacy. Commercial drones can be modified with explosives in a garage. AI-powered targeting is just over the horizon. Swarming tactics using dozens or hundreds of coordinated UAVs could overwhelm even the best air defenses. The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia and their allies are scrambling to adapt. New detection systems, laser interceptors and advanced counter-drone doctrines are in deployment. But every step forward leads to a new counter-move, because the grey zone, by definition, never, ever stands still. Iran's strategy was simple. Make the cost of retaliation high, make the attribution blurry, let proxies bleed your enemy, one attack at a time, until the price of staying outweighs the price of leaving. And so the region lives with a new kind of normal. Tension, constant grinding, and just below the red line. The world watches, waiting for one strike, for one miscalculation that pushes us over the edge and into open warfare. Because in the age of grey zone warfare, the drone isn't just a weapon, it's a message, and everybody's listening. To be more specific about what we discussed, let us give you some specifics. In the Middle East, Iran has increasingly employed unmanned systems and used proxies as grey zone weapons. Since late 2023, Iran-backed militias, the so-called Islamic Resistance in Iraq umbrella, have launched scores of drones, of rockets and of missiles attacking US forces and allies. For instance, in January 2024, a coordinated strike in Jordan killed 3 US soldiers. The US responded with strikes on IRGC-affiliated targets. US officials report that these militias carried out over 180 attacks on US forces in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan between the October 2023 and August 2024 period. They even launched drones against Israeli positions in the Golan Heights and Eilat. These Iranian proxies allowed Iran the luxury of indulging in plausible deniability operations. They act as covert operators in an axis of resistance, quote unquote, to pressure both US and Israelis out open war. Iran itself has also used drones as direct weapons. In April 2024, Iran launched a massive barrage of drones and missiles at Israel, more than 200 combined weapons, in what Israeli forces called their first direct strike on Israeli soil. A few months later, we ended up with the mess we have today. That is, being relatively and uncomfortably close to open war inside the Middle East. Now, let's look at what they have been using. Well, such attacks use relatively low-cost loitering munitions. For example, the Iranian Shahed suicide drone. They use them to pressure an adversary while avoiding attribution or full-scale retaliation. Similarly, Iran's Houthi allies in Yemen have fired ballistic missiles and armed drones at Israeli targets and international shipping. Since late 2023, the actions that Iran framed as support for Gaza have been increasing. These proxy strikes force regional adversaries to divert air defenses and naval patrols, demonstrating the coercive effect of drones in the grey zone. Iranian UAV attacks have been the norm. Drones and missiles fired by Iran or its proxies at military targets have been a game changer. We have the paramilitary proxies who are also part of this grand grey zone strategy. Groups like Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias and Houthis carry out raids and rocket attacks to advance Iran's aims. Overall, Iran's grey zone campaigns combine technology and proxies rather than declaring war. And Tehran unleashes a sea of surrogates with drones and missiles to exact revenge or deter adversaries. This is the new game. This is the grey zone, as we define it. Why do they do this? Well, they do this because it minimizes direct exposure while still inflicting damage and raising costs for US or Israeli actions. Now, for our second case study, we will look at Taiwan under siege and Beijing's silent pressure campaign. If the Middle East is the world's live-fire laboratory for drone and proxy warfare, the Taiwan Strait is its pressure cooker. A place where the grey zone isn't just a theory, but daily grinding reality. Let's set the scene. It's the middle of the night in Taipei. On the surface, the city is calm. Scooters humming, neon lights, and midnight snacks. But high above, on radars, deep in the mountains, alarms are sounding. Chinese fighter jets, bombers, surveillance planes and drones are entering Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Again. Not just once, not just on special occasions or black swan events, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of times a year. In 2024 alone, the PLA Air Force and Navy conducted over 3,000 incursions into Taiwan's EDIZ. That's almost 9 times a day. Sometimes it's just a handful of jets. Other times it's massive, coordinated sorties, a signal to Taiwan and to the world that Beijing is always watching, always pressuring, and always ready. Why does China do this, you may ask? Well, because in the age of grey zone warfare, you don't need to invade to conquer. You can harass, you can exhaust, you can intimidate. You force your adversary to scramble jets, burn fuel, wear down pilots, and spend money they can't afford to lose. You make the abnormal, the constant threat, seem normal. This isn't just about military pressure either. China's campaign against Taiwan is three-dimensional: military, cyber, and psychological. Let's take cyber for a start. In 2024, Taiwan's government documented more than 2 million pieces of Chinese disinformation. Fake news, fake videos, fake social media accounts, all designed to undermine confidence in Taiwan's democracy, to amplify division, and to create the sense that resistance is hopeless. Add to that the restlessness of cyberattacks. You have government agencies, infrastructure, energy grids, and media being probed daily for weaknesses. Hackers plant backdoors, exfiltrate sensitive data, and disrupt election coverage. Sometimes it's clumsy, other times it's surgical. But it's always there in the background, a veritable digital siege. And then there's the economic front. When Taiwan's president meets with a US official, Beijing slaps new trade restrictions, blocks key exports, or launches punitive customs checks. When a foreign company calls Taiwan a country, the Chinese government threatens boycotts, pulls contracts, and reminds everybody that China's market is too big to ignore. Even international law becomes a weapon. Chinese officials claimed with a straight face that Taiwan is not a country but a renegade province. So when PLA drones or civilian balloons float over Taiwan frontline islands, Beijing claims it's just flying over Chinese territory. When Taiwanese forces shoot down an intruding drone, the message is, "Why are you attacking your own countrymen?" It's all part of a doctrine the PLA calls salami slicing. Take a little here, push a little there. Never so much that the world must respond, but never so little that the pressure goes away. You cut undersea cables? Blame fishing accidents. You buzz a Taiwanese destroyer with drones, or you do a dangerously close flyover with one of your airplanes. Well, you call it a freedom of navigation patrol. You launch a coordinated cyber attack on election day. You claim ignorance, then use fake accounts to spread rumors of chaos. This is the quote-unquote anaconda strategy. You squeeze slowly so the victim barely notices until they can't breathe. Taiwan's response? Resilience, constant drills, investment in cyber defense, counter-disinformation, and asymmetric warfare. Allies, especially the United States and Japan, send signals of support, sometimes with warships, sometimes with high-level visits, sometimes with new arms sales and joint statements. But the cost is undeniably high. Taiwanese pilots are exhausted. The military is stretched thin. Civil society lives with the constant hum of a threat, a daily grind that erodes morale and creates the risk of fatal mistakes. And the risk of escalation is always present. What if a PLA jet collides with a Taiwanese F-16? What if a missile test goes astray, or a cyber attack knocks out more critical infrastructure than it intended? What if the world is distracted by another war, another election, another pandemic, and China decides the time is right to cross the line? This is the veritable heart of darkness, the heart of the gray zone. No declaration, no front lines, no uniforms, just a battle of nerves, will, and stamina. And now, Beijing seems content to play the long game, grinding, harassing, probing, waiting for the day when Taiwan or its friends make a mistake. What is the lesson for the world? Well, the lesson could be put like this. In the grey zone, the line between peace and war is never clear. And by the time you know it's been crossed, it may be far, far too late to do anything about it. China's grey zone tactics are fascinating, so we shall go a bit deeper into it. Let's look at China's strategy toward Taiwan. It exemplifies modern grey zone competition. Beyond official military planning for invasion, the PLA now continuously harasses Taiwan air, sea and information environment without firing a shot. You have air and maritime intrusions. In 2024, the PLA conducted a record number of aircraft sorties into Taiwan and its Air Defense Identification Zone, its ADIZ as we previously call it, or ADIZ if you prefer it. And what does this mean? Well, open source tallies show over 3,000 incursions in 2024, far above the 1,700 per year was the norm in 2022 and 2023. These sorties include fighter jets, bombers, and even civilian drones drifting near frontline islands. In one account, PLA grey zone warfare has these days become a near daily fighter overflight around Taiwan. Such operations force Taiwan to scramble jets and exhaust radar resources constantly, gradually constraining its freedom of action. Then we have harassment operations. That is regular sorties which include fighters, drones and even weather balloons into Taiwan's ADIZ and near-shore areas. For example, PLA planes flew about 1,727 incursions in 2022. Similar levels in 2023. Then we have a spike of over 3,000 in 2024. Each incident compels Taiwan to respond. Flights and alerts are the norm. This creates wear and tear and psychological pressure without crossing into outright war. Then we have the humorously named but remarkably serious and deadly salami slicing tactics. China links most drills and harassment to political causes. For example, foreign leaders visiting Taipei. It has even indulged in cutting undersea communications cables to Taiwan in 2023 and 2024. This was done ostensibly to test blockade scenarios. Taiwan's naval chief calls this the PLA's Anaconda strategy, squeezing Taiwan by exhausting its response system and testing their limits. China also projects power via non-kinetic means. It runs cyber campaigns against Taiwan's government and military, and pervasive disinformation to erode public confidence. Taiwan's security agencies reported that China's disinformation output surged 60% in 2024 to some 2.16 million posts spread via fake social media accounts and AI-generated videos. These are aimed to sow confusion about democracy and US support. At the same time, Beijing deploys legal and political warfare, leveraging UN votes, economic incentives or punishments, and propaganda to isolate Taiwan internationally. Chinese officials even dismiss stray incursions. For example, they dismiss them as civilian drones, as domestic activity on Chinese territory, denying the very concept of Taiwan's sovereignty. Then we have legal and political warfare, invoking one China claims and maritime laws to justify grey zone moves. For instance, after a foreign drone over Kinmen was shot down, Beijing's foreign ministry quipped that Chinese drones flying over China's territory is not something worth being surprised at, thereby undermining Taiwan's jurisdiction. China also pressures third parties, be it diplomats or companies, to bar Taiwan's recognition or trade, weaponizing diplomatic ties as part of the coercion campaign. Then we have information operations. State media and online outlets push narratives via fake accounts, bots and AI clips in order to discredit Taiwan's government and magnify division. These information attacks, like large-scale cyber penetrations of Taiwanese networks, are integral to Beijing's grey zone pressure. The net effect is to keep Taiwan in a constant state of tension. As many experts have noted, China's intimidatory tactics aim to deter independence and make normal governance more difficult. So long as Taiwan's leaders refuse to yield, Beijing is reportedly capable of escalating to quarantines or blockades, using coercive tactics or even limited strikes seen as punitive tactics, but it also remains just below the threshold of full invasion. Coming up, we will discuss how proxy armies, mercenaries and cyber warriors are redrawing the boundaries of conflict, and why no one, anywhere, is safe from the reach of the grey zone. In order to do that, we need to discuss the global proxy game. Let us shift our focus from the halls of power to the shadowy corners where modern war is outsourced just like any other commodity. Because, in the age of grey zone warfare, the most effective soldier might not even wear a uniform, or even speak the language of the country that he is fighting for. This is the era of the proxy, of the mercenary, of the deniable force. It's a world where Iran's reach stretches from the black valleys of Baghdad to the mountains of Lebanon, where Russia's will is done in the gold mines of Africa, and where the Houthis of Yemen were not so long ago just a regional curiosity, have become actors capable of disrupting global shipping lanes with little more than a phone call from Tehran. Why do major powers use proxies, you may ask? Well, the answer is as old as war itself, dear listeners. Deniability, flexibility, and the ability to fight without paying the price in blood, or the price in treasure, or even face international condemnation. Let's talk Iran. For decades, Tehran has mastered the art of resistance by remote control, if you will. The IRGC funds, trains, and arms militias across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah, and other Shia militias in Iraq. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, Syria paramilitaries, Palestinian factions, each one a chess piece in Iran's regional game. In 2023 and 2024, the world just saw how effective these proxies could be, when the aforementioned 180 attacks against American bases occurred via these proxies. If a US soldier dies, Tehran could feign innocence. These are local grievances. We have nothing to do with it. All the while, Iran signals to Washington and to Jerusalem alike, we can bleed you without risking direct retaliation. Well, that shows how well that went. Just look at Iran these days. Anyways, Hezbollah, for its part, has spent years digging tunnels, building arsenals, and preparing for a day when the shadow of war becomes open conflict. Yet even now, when it has been severely diminished, it still has drones and still has even a limited capability of missile attack. This is just deadly enough to remind Israel of the cost of escalation, but deniable enough to avoid an all-out war. And then there are the Houthis, armed with Iranian drones, missiles, and the latest in asymmetric naval tactics. The Houthis have turned the Red Sea, one of the world's key shipping corridors, into a battlefield. They fired at Israeli ports, seized commercial vessels, and sent insurance premiums for global trade through the roof. Every attack gives Iran leverage without Tehran ever raising its flag. But the game isn't limited to the Middle East. Just take a look for a second at Africa, where the Russian government, facing sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the quagmire of the Ukraine, has turned to its own proxies. The infamous Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Africa Corps. These mercenaries fight for gold, for contracts, and for influence, and Moscow's broader ambitions. In the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Sudan, or in Libya, Wagner mercenaries guard presidents, crush rebellions, secure mining rights, and eliminate rivals. They do what regular Russian forces cannot, or what the Kremlin wants to have the ability to deny. When the United Nations or Western governments cry foul, Russia shrugs. They're just private contractors. We can't control everything. But everybody knows the real score. This pattern repeats itself in conflict after conflict. Proxy militias in Ukraine's Donbas region, Turkish-backed fighters in Libya, Pakistani non-state actors in Kashmir. The playbook is the same. Deploy the deniable, exploit the plausible, and escalate the ambiguous. In the cyber realm, the proxies may not even be human at this point. States employ independent hacker groups, some criminal, some patriotic, and some just mercenaries for hire, to attack infrastructure, to steal secrets, to plant disinformation. These disposable people and sometimes AI programs are the bread and butter of modern cybernetic warfare. The government can always say, oh, it wasn't us, it was the rogue group acting on its own. But the line between rogue and regime has never been more blurred. The logic of proxies is simple. They give states reach without risk and power without accountability. But there is still a price. Every time a proxy strikes, it raises the risk of uncontrolled escalation. What if a drone launched by a militia kills the wrong target, like a visiting dignitary? What if a mercenary group oversteps and triggers a massacre or sparks a wider conflict? The sponsor can deny responsibility, but the world still burns. And for those living in the proxy battlegrounds, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, West Africa, the suffering is not deniable. It's real, it's daily, and it's getting worse. The age of proxies means the age of endless, low-intensity conflict. Wars that never quite start, but never truly end. And the global powers, safe in their capitals, play chess with lives on board. Now, let's look a bit at the actual proxy actors and paramilitary escalation tactics. Well, grey zone tactics often rely on proxy forces and paramilitary groups to do the dirty work. Iran's militia and Hezbollah, Russia's Wagner, and other shadow armies operate in the gaps between state conflicts. These groups can launch deniable strikes or foment instability far from their patron's borders. For example, during the 2023-2024 Israel war, Iran's Lebanese proxy Hezbollah fired near daily rocket and missile barrages into Israel. And Tehran publicly claimed that they employed restraint. But enough about Middle Eastern proxies. We've already explored how Hezbollah in Lebanon and various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria represent Iran's grey zone strategic depth, and how they conduct skirmishes, rocket attacks on Israel or US targets, while Iran maintains plausible deniability. We've also discussed how Russia's Wagner group and its renamed affiliate, the Africa Corps, exemplifies grey zone expeditionary forces. Though not openly part of Russia's military, Wagner has fought alongside local governments in Mali, the Central African Republic, and the Ukraine alike. Analysts note that mercenaries like Wagner serve a Russian surrogate, and they capitalize on discontent, projecting power without formal intervention. And in grey zone terms, they offer a flexible tool for overseas operations, especially in places where Russia lacks official bases, or, they seek deniability. Overall, proxy and paramilitary forces let great powers apply pressure far from their home turf. These actors complicate attribution and allow governments to claim they are not officially at war. They can escalate conflict suddenly, just like Hezbollah did, or the Houthis, yet their ties to sponsors provide some shadow protection from retaliation. This is the global proxy game, and as long as the world remains unwilling to call it for what it is, that is, war by other means, the game will simply go on. Now let's look at cyber sabotage and economic warfare. The most dangerous front lines of today's grey zone wars aren't traced on maps. They run through cables, clouds and capital flows. The new shock troops don't wear uniforms. They carry laptops, flash drives and the tools of information warfare. Let's talk about the cyber domain. It's not just a playground for hackers and script kiddies anymore. No, it's a theater of operations. NATO even said so. And it's recognized by militaries, defense ministries and intelligence agencies as a domain of war. Take Taiwan. In 2024, more than 2 million pieces of disinformation, fake news and deepfake content, most traced back to China, flooded social media ahead of the presidential election. Doesn't that sound familiar? Where did I hear that before, I wonder? I must be just imagining things. Anyways, botnets pushed rumors about voting fraud, cyber attacks hit electoral infrastructure, and AI-generated videos try to undermine public confidence in the entire democratic process. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was 1,000 little cuts, sapping trust, inflaming division, and making every vote a source of suspicion. This isn't unique to Taiwan. In the United States, in the European Union, in the Ukraine and India, everywhere there are elections or contentious debates, you can be sure some foreign power is working to tilt the scales from behind the scenes, be it Russian troll farms, Chinese cyber militias, or Iranian influence operations. At this point, even non-state actors join the fray, hired for cause or for a payout. The cyber war isn't just about perception. It's about infrastructure as well. When the world's eyes were on Gaza or Tehran or Kyiv, there was always another battleground being fought in the dark. Attacks on energy grids, on water supplies, on port operations and even on financial systems. In 2025, US officials warned of rising Iranian cyber operations targeting America's utilities and pipelines. Just a few lines of code can bring down a hospital network or freeze a city's traffic or, God forbid, interfere with aerial circulation. Just imagine what happens to flight corridors when there is no air traffic control. Death and chaos. That's what happens. So just these few lines of code could bring down the entire Western infrastructure. The entire infrastructure which guarantees us the water we drink, the car we drive, the money we take out of the ATM. No bombs, no bullets, just clicks. Let us not forget about good old, plain old, real world, physical sabotage. Pipelines mysteriously exploding in the Baltic. Fiber optic cables mysteriously being cut under the sea. Sabotage of rail lines in Europe. Or attacks on energy facilities in the Middle East. All carried out in ways that blur the line between accident and act of war. Was it a gas leak or an act of sabotage? A technical glitch or a state-sponsored hack? Who benefits and who gets the blame? That's the entire point. In the grey zone, attribution is murky by design. And then there's economic warfare. Sanctions, boycotts, blockades, once used only in open hostilities, are now tools of daily statecraft. China can block imports from Lithuania because of a diplomatic spat over Taiwan. The US could freeze Russian oligarchs' assets in London, Dubai or Cyprus. The European could use access to its single market as leverage in every negotiation from vaccine contracts to rare earth minerals. Even payment systems such as SWIFT, CHIPS or MIR are weapons now, with countries building alternative channels to hedge against financial exclusion. What's the net effect, you may ask? Well, the world where every connection is a vulnerability has become a reality. Every supply chain, every data center, every power line is a target, and the attacker is often invisible. For ordinary people like you and me, it means a world of rising prices, of blackouts, of delayed shipments, and the creeping sense that nothing is really safe. Not your vote, not your job, not even the lights in your own private home. For governments, it's a world where escalation is easy and deniability is plausible. Launch a cyber attack, then claim it was a criminal group or a damn technical error. Sabotage a cable, then blame a fishing trawler. Block trade, then point to, national security or unforeseen circumstances or anything vague like that. In the cyber and economic gray zone, the only real rule is that there are no rules. And the first casualty is always the public trust. Given the highly technological era of communication that we live in, I feel the need to make a special, more technical discussion, with the risk of repeating myself, about cyber warfare and information operations. Why do I do this? Well, there's a method to my madness. I believe that this is the kind of operation in which all of us finds himself or herself vulnerable. You can very rarely suffer from an actual drone strike if, you live in Latvia or you live in Portugal. But we are, all of us, no matter where we live, no matter how well educated we are, vulnerable to cyber warfare and, depending on how well they're made, on information operations. Grey zone conflict increasingly unfolds in cyberspace, as previously mentioned, and in the information realm alike. Cyber attacks, electronic warfare, and disinformation are now routine tools of coercion. States and their proxies probe adversary networks, looking for vulnerabilities and spread false narratives to weaken resolve. As I've mentioned, the closest example to mind is Taiwan's government, which warned that in 2025, China has dramatically stepped up online disinformation, posting over 2 million pieces of fake news or biased news last year via inauthentic social media accounts. Beijing also conducts hacking and influence operations aimed at Taiwan, manipulating social media algorithms and even using AI to generate fake video content. Similarly, US and EU agencies report frequent cyber penetrations of infrastructure, such as energy grids, communications and defense networks, by Chinese and Russian hackers under the guise of espionage or training for something larger. These cyber and information campaigns can coerce or undermine an adversary without a shot being fired. Critical infrastructure such as power plants, water systems, and ports are particularly high-value targets. US officials in mid-2025 warned that as the Israel-Iran war expands, Iranian hackers may strike American power grids and utilities, according to Politico. At the same time, malicious actors use social media to incite unrest or propagate conspiracy. A recent example, false posts on Taiwan's networks falsely claiming sabotage on election day, which needed to be debunked by authorities, or it was too late. The goal of these grey zone info ops is to sow distrust, slow response, and create political friction. Cyber attacks are the norm. State-affiliated hackers infiltrate military and civilian networks seeking intelligence or planting malware. These attacks are hard to trace and normalize aggression. In Ukraine and elsewhere, thousands of cyber intrusions have occurred under the threshold of declared war. In the 2023 to 2025 time span, we saw alerts about shields up, warnings and emergency patches in preparation for expected intrusions by Iranian and Russian cyber units. Then we have good old propaganda and disinformation. Isn't this lovely? Governments overtly and covertly utilizing media campaigns to shape perception, China's United Front or Russia's RT network and Iranian media all flood global social media with tailored narratives. In the Taiwanese case, Beijing funneled pro-China comments into Taiwanese news sites and forums to undermine trust in democracy. In Europe, Russian trolls and bots spread black propaganda and conspiracy theories to destabilize Western politics. This is a classical grey zone exploitation of free media. These cyber and informational fronts are explicitly recognized as grey zone instruments. They evade military rules of engagement, violating neither territorial sovereignty nor airspace. Yet, they can cripple systems. And, as it happened in 2022, cyber attacks in Ukraine, for example, damaged the power grid. Or they can be used to tilt public opinion, as in foreign election meddling. International law in cyberspace remains unsettled, giving aggressors room to maneuver. Victims face a dilemma: retaliate and risk war, or absorb the damage and risk prolonged subversion. For our next segment, we will discuss who wins the battle for the grey zone. Well, to the question, we will try to provide the answer. After all, this is the question that every strategist, policymaker, and security chief is asking behind closed doors. But maybe the answer isn't what anyone wants to hear. On paper, the grey zone looks like a chessboard. Smart states use proxies, drones, cyber attacks, economic levers, always maneuvering, never triggering open war. They get what they want, or at least prevent what they fear, without a catastrophic risk of a direct clash. Iran can pressure the US and Israel, tying up resources across the Middle East without risking the annihilation of Tehran or the end of the regime. China can grind down Taiwan's nerves, test US resolve, and slowly shift the status quo without firing a shot or invading actual troops Taiwan. This is the perfect scenario in which there is no invitation to global outrage, because they can always employ plausible deniability, as we said 20 times already. In this grey zone world, it is the bold and the ruthless that get to shape reality, one ambiguous move at a time. Whoever has the stamina, whoever has the patience, whoever has the willingness to operate in the shadows, tend to come out ahead. And as long as open societies hesitate, bound by laws, by public scrutiny, by moral and political checks, autocracies and revisionist powers have the advantage. But let's look closer. The real answer is far more complicated. For every tactical win, the grey zone breeds new dangers. Miscalculation is baked in. And when no one knows where the red lines are, they become easier to cross by mistake or on purpose. A malicious drone kills American soldiers in Jordan. Does Washington retaliate? That's the question. A Chinese jet collides with a Taiwanese F-16. Is it an accident, a provocation, or a spark of war? A pipeline is sabotaged, or a blackout darkens a capital's city. Who pulls the trigger? And who pays the price if the wrong country gets blamed? As the rules fade, paranoia grows, and the international system is already fragmenting. The public stops trusting not just governments, but the news, elections, and even their own neighbors. When every blackout might be sabotage, every price spike could be a hostile act, and every rumor a foreign plot, the social fabric starts to unravel. And here's the biggest irony of all. Grey zone tactics are supposed to keep the peace, but layer enough aggression, enough pressure, enough little attacks, and suddenly the risk of all-out war is higher than ever. Deterrence phrase, thresholds blur, and the urge to teach a lesson or restore credibility grows stronger until somebody finally fires the shot the world has been holding its breath to avoid, and we all end up in the Third World War. Ask the Ukrainians, who lived through years of hybrid war before Russia went in. Ask the Baltic states or the people of the South China Sea how it feels to live every day knowing that the peace you have is temporary and could end with a single mistake. So, who really wins? Maybe in the end, no one. Not the strong men who believe that ambiguity buys the time. Not the democracy scrambling to adapt to a new kind of constant, shapeless threat. Not the ordinary people who pay the price, be it in anxiety, in opportunity, or in lives lost to the shadows. The only certainty in the grey zone is uncertainty itself. And the one thing history teaches us is this: games played in the shadows don't stay there forever. Sooner or later, someone turns on the light, and what's been simmering in the grey area erupts into open conflict. Now let's discuss international law, norms and sovereignty in the grey zone for a bit. Grey zone actors routinely exploit legal grey areas. By definition, their actions avoid clear violations of the UN's Charter prohibition on force. Instead, they argue for lawful justifications or ambiguity. For instance, China has the legal stance that Taiwan is internal Chinese territory. Thus, People's Liberation Army patrols or Coast Guard, law enforcement around Taiwan are framed as routine policing within sovereign territory. When Taiwan shot down a PLA drone, as we previously mentioned in 2022, Beijing claimed simply that Chinese drones flying over China's territory is not something worth being surprised at. Similarly, Russia's actions in Crimea or cyber intrusions are often justified as defense of our people despite violating others' sovereignty. International law concepts like neutrality, non-intervention and sovereignty are being stretched in practice. Grey zone campaigns often mask warlike behavior as something else, for example, calling a drone strike a counter-terrorist operation. Even humanitarian law risks obfuscation. The ICRC warns that labeling conflicts as hybrid or grey should not excuse violation of the laws of war. Yet, states purposely blur the lines. For example, Iran's use of foreign proxies is framed as support for resistance, not open aggression, even when US bases are hit. Governments also selectively invoke legal language, be they treaties or UN charters, to claim legitimacy. So, what we have here is norm exploitation. Aggressors claim legitimacy by twisting norms. All of this is framed inside the one Chinese academic concept called the free warfares. Open uses of legal actions, public opinion, and media as weapons to undermine opponents without fighting. In effect, grey zone tactics use legal rhetoric to smear the adversaries and firm one's own position. For example, Beijing might accuse Taiwan's government of provocative independence moves to justify nearby military drills, even as those drills violate Taiwan's airspace. Likewise, Russia cites the 1939 Molotov Pact or historical claims to justify annexations, even though international courts clearly rule otherwise. In practice, the threshold of war remains subjective. One state's permissible signal, a cyberattack, is another's casus belli. A report on conflict law noted that in 2024, over 120 armed conflicts were already underway, so adding grey zone shadow battles can risk dragging states into the fray. Victim states and allies thus seek to redefine or clarify norms. For example, NATO's 2022 Madrid policy language explicitly includes cyber and subversion in collective defense. But until legal consensus evolves, and it rarely keeps up with the reality on the ground, grey zone actors will keep employing all these tools, and they will seize on any ambiguity in sovereignty and law to wage coercion by stealth. Now, for everybody's favorite segment, the big picture. If I were to give a title in my own characteristic sense, today's big picture segment could be titled Shadows at Noon, or The World the Grey Zone Built. This is the moment when we step back, pull the camera up and try to see the whole board. The logic, the patterns and the outcomes we can no longer afford to ignore. If you've stayed with us so far, first of all, we're grateful. We know this is not an easy thing to listen to. But you already know that the age of the grey zone war is not a blip. It's not a temporary disorder. It's the new physics of international relations. One that's already reshaping power, sovereignty and security on every continent. But what does this really mean for our future? Let's follow the ripples all the way out. First, we have the twilight of clarity. The old certainties have collapsed. For most of the 20th century, the great powers, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes by force, have kept certain rules in check. Wars were declared, borders were mostly respected, and when things went wrong, there was a number to call, a line to draw, and a council to convene. Diplomacy was exhausting, yes, and there were always proxy fights and some degree of subterfuge, but the basic line between war and peace, between soldier and civilian, was visible to all. I'm afraid to say that this is no longer the case. Today's conflict is smeared across every layer of society. Grey zone tactics, drones, proxies, cyberattacks, economic strangulation, all erase the boundaries. Who is the aggressor and who is the victim? Who started it and who escalated? By the time the world figures it out, the damage is already done. This isn't just a strategic headache. It is a psychological transformation. States, societies, and even individuals are trapped in a world where everything is possible, everything is deniable, and no one is ever sure what will happen tomorrow. The first casualty in the twilight is trust. Trust in the system, trust in the news, trust in the elections, trust in the very notion of cause and effect. Then we have the weaponization of everything. In this grey zone warfare era, everything is a weapon. Grey zone war weaponizes every domain of life. The battlefield is everywhere. The chip in your phone, the shipping lane carrying your grain or your oil or your clothes, the servers storing your health records, the bank routing your payments, or the app that is shaping your opinions. Your country's economy targeted by sanctions, trade bans, or unexpected custom checks. Your politics flooded with fake news, deep fakes, bots, and micro-targeted propaganda. Your infrastructure vulnerable to ransomware, blackouts, and sabotage at the flip of a switch. It is reasonable to state, as somebody previously did, that the next war will be won by those who can operate inside the other side's system before the shooting even starts. In the grey zone, there is no rear area, no safe zone, no normal life. Nothing is left untouched by the logic of conflict. This means every state, every company, every citizen is now a potential combatant, a potential target, or even a potential pawn. Then we have the great unraveling, the risks and the new tipping points. Here's the hard truth. Grey zone tactics are designed to avoid escalation, but by normalizing aggression, by lowering the threshold for what is tolerated, they make real war more likely, not less. History is replete with this paradox. Russia's little green men in Crimea in 2014 were part of hybrid war. They were deniable, bloodless casualties until it turned into open grinding warfare in the Donbass and now in all of the Ukraine. Or we can take the years of cyber probing and economic pressure between US and China. Once this was a low boil, now it seems to be a strategic rivalry in which either side could make a fatal miscalculation in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Iran's drones and proxies were also a never constant reality. They are effective in harassing adversaries, but in January 2024, the deadly strike on US troops in Jordan pushed Washington and Tehran to the brink. And these days, we are reasonably close to an open war with Iran inside the Middle East, with ramifications which boggle the imagination of even the most astute analyst. What we can state is that escalation ladders have become a ladder missing rungs. No one knows if the next step is a slap, a punch, or a plunge into the abyss. What's worse? Well, when attribution is murky and the threshold for retaliation is unclear, governments are forced to react to perception, not to facts. The risk of accidental war sparked by a misread cyberattack, a drone strike, or a proxy gone rogue has never been higher. Then we have the rise of the unaccountable. The grey zone also breeds a world where responsibility evaporates. It becomes quickly a fiction. Authoritarian regimes and revisionist powers, well versed in lawfare, in media manipulation, and in plausible deniability, gain a structural advantage. If a botnet hacks your election, you can always blame the criminals. If a drone hits your base, you can always blame the militias. It wasn't us. If the price of oil spikes because of weather in the Strait of Hormuz, and the word weather was quote-unquote, of course, you can always shrug and cite market forces. Democracies, for all their strengths and beautiful ideals, struggle in this new world. They are built for transparency, for checks and balances, and for open debate. All of which are vulnerabilities when every aspect of daily life can be turned against you by a patient, relentless adversary. Alliances too are strained these days. NATO, the EU, the US-Japan alliance all face the challenge of collective defense against threats that may not trigger Article 5 but erode security day by day. What we can take out of this is that this is the return of the long game. Grey zone strategies, after all, thrive on time, on grinding down the adversary, on sowing doubt, on exhausting resistance, and on eroding cohesion. China's approach to Taiwan is the textbook case. You have no real need of tanks on the beachhead if you can make your target too tired, too divided, or simply too economically dependent to resist. Iran's web of proxies lets it shape the region's balance of power over years, not weeks. Or at least this was the case until let's just say that they punched above their weight limit. And then we have Russia's tactics in Africa and Europe, exploiting every crack in Western unity, every opening in international law. The West, for its part, is now racing to adapt, investing in resilience, counter-disinformation, cyber defense, and the whole of society approach. But bureaucracies move slowly, and the grey zone enemy never sleeps. We have societal resilience and the human factor, which is no longer a buzzword. Here's where the big picture gets truly personal. In this new world, as I said before, resilience is not just a buzzword. It's the difference between survival and collapse. Societies that invest in civic trust, in media literacy, in infrastructure protection, and in rapid crisis response have a fighting chance. We're entering a new era, an era where every citizen matters, not just as a voter or a consumer, but as a node in the web of security. When trust is a target, the defense must start at home. We are heading towards a new code or a new chaos. Can we build new norms, new laws, a new Geneva Convention for the grey zone? Some strategists argue for clear red lines, collective sanctions, and even preemptive action against persistent grey zone actors. Others warn that overreacting is exactly what adversaries want, that democracies must balance firmness with restraint, lest they be drawn into escalation on the enemy's terms. International law is struggling to catch up. UN charters and treaties lag behind the speed of technological change, and deliberate ambiguity of grey zone moves makes consensus rare and enforcement weaker still. What's clear is this: without some new form of global consensus, or at least new adaptive doctrine, the risk of endless low-intensity conflict will grow, and the odds of a major war by mistake or design will rise with every passing year. The stakes for the next decade are increasingly clear in the way that we stand at a crossroads. If we adapt through alliance, innovation, education, and above all by strengthening the fabric of open society, we can turn the logic of the grey zone against its architects, exposing deniability, closing vulnerability, and rebuilding trust, and, most importantly, deterring escalation. But if we don't, if we allow fatigue, division, cynicism, or even apathy take root, we risk sliding into a future where every day is a crisis and every conflict is endless, and the line between peace and war is erased for a generation. This is not just a matter for generals and diplomats. It's for journalists, for teachers, for technologists, for activists, for voters, everyone who refuses to surrender reality to shadow and doubt. Because the greatest threat of the grey zone is not the drone, nor the hacker, nor the proxy army, is the normalization of confusion. A world where the truth is whatever power says it is, where the enemy is everywhere, and where the price of clarity is more than anyone is willing to pay, until the very end. The risk of escalation and unintended war is huge. But in conclusion, clarity has become these days a strategic asset. So where does that leave us? Well, in a world of grey, the greatest act of resistance is to demand clarity, to see through the denials, the distractions, the plausible lies, to prepare, to adapt, to keep faith with the best traditions of open society and free debate, because the shadows can only win if we let the sun go down. This has been Realpolitik Confidential, Episode 8, From Tehran to Taipei, the Age of Grey Zone War. I have been your humble host, Alex Krishan, and remember, less ideology, more analysis. Stay safe out there, and God bless you all. Good day.